Our next speaker is Giuliana Rotola from the St. Anna School of Advanced Studies.
Thank you. So I will build a little bit upon the presentation of Rafael and Aaron, and I will try not to repeat too much of what was already said. So I've been leading the international group, so we have been looking at some of the questions that Aaron presented from an international law perspective. And the goal of our work has been to understand what is the role of international organization in an evolving space governance, and what are the different instruments that can be used for the protection of dark and quiet skies. So there is not a single avenue that can we use for the protection of dark and quiet skies that are diverse. There is a set of diverse tools that we can use in parallel, and so we have been looking at that. Again, space governance is changing a lot, and international organizations are playing a pivotal role in understanding how to address the implication of the activities that have been evolving in the past decades, like the implication of satellite constellations on astronomical observations. So there are no single institutions, but there are diverse instruments. And in particular, we have been looking at how all of these organizations can look at the nature of astronomy, or these tools can help us looking into the nature of astronomy and astronomical observation, the nature of space and the nature of low Earth orbit, and how we can think about what comes after damage has already been occurring, and so what if orbital pollution can constitute a form of damage. I will start from the nature of astronomy and astronomical observation. So, as Aaron said, from a conceptual perspective, there is no doubt that astronomy has always been for millennia a way of exploring outer space. However, this translation in a legal vocabulary is not necessarily that straightforward. So there have been multiple studies that have been looking at the understanding of astronomy and astronomical observation as a form of use and exploration of outer space. And so the boundaries of what can be defined as use of exploration of outer space have been tested in the past years. As already Rafael also mentioned, there is not an explicit definition of what exploration and use means, but we have the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties that is the main tool that is guiding us in the interpretation of international law instruments. If we look at the general meaning, for example, of astronomy in a basic book dictionary like the Oxford English Dictionary, we can see that the definition of astronomy fits the criteria of use and exploration of outer space. And we also can look at the context in which use and exploration have been used. And the fact that Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, in the various freedoms that are listed, includes also the freedom of scientific investigation, make us support the case for the inclusion of astronomical observation under the protection of the treaty. Astronomy has been discussed, even if not in a consistent way within COPUS, that is the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and is the body that is responsible for the evolving interpretation and implementation of this treaty. So it's very important to see that even this body has been discussing the role of astronomy, and so that also is like another point that can lead us to understand astronomy as a form of exploration of outer space and as something that can be protected through these instruments. Why we want to understand astronomy as a form of exploration and use of outer space? Because we want to have the possibility of using those limitations that are included in the Outer Space Treaty for conducting outer space activities. And Article 9 was already mentioned, is one of the main limitations for the activities of outer space, for the coordination of actors conducting space activities. Due regard and corresponding interest are not explicitly defined in the Outer Space Treaty, but still they are outlining binding obligations for countries. So there is a direct obligations of thinking about the other, from other actors' perspective, and thinking about what are the interests of other actors. It was mentioned before that there is not a hierarchy of activities in outer space, so there are valuable interests on different sides. So corresponding doesn't mean that the interest needs to be identical. It means that, for example, two actors wants to operate in the same space, means that two actors can conduct activities that may potentially cause interference. In our case, satellite constellations and the freedom of using space for commercial purposes and the freedom of scientific investigation, for example, for astronomical observation. So we need to understand how to ensure that all of these interests are treated with mutual respect, and we need to understand how to find the balance between all of these different interests. Now, I mentioned before that there is not a single avenue to protect dark and quiet skies. So we have been looking at COPUS and the Outer Space Treaty and other international space law instruments, but we also need to look at something else. So we went into reading it and studying the role of the ITU in the protection of dark and quiet skies. And our guiding questions have been, is the ITU framework a relevant analog for protecting dark and quiet skies? Can this framework be expanded to protect dark and quiet skies? And one of the guiding questions in this context has also been, are orbital slots around Earth, the low Earth orbit, and the frequency spectrum a limited or scarce natural resource? The answer is yes, because we have this answer in the ITU framework. We have it in the preamble of the long-term sustainability guidelines. But what does it mean? How can we use this framework to ensure that this scarce natural resource is used in an equitable way? So we have been looking at how this framework can be used for the protection of dark and quiet skies. If we move forward from space law, we can look at the broader field of international law. So it was mentioned that Article 3 implies the applicability of all of the different fields of international law to outer space, but that doesn't mean that automatically all of the field of international law can be applied to outer space. And so we have been looking at what is space. From a conceptual perspective, space is a physical environment where we have been operating for decades. But again, this doesn't mean that from a legal perspective, space is necessarily considered an environment. We have seen in the past decades that some principles of international environmental law have already been applied, like the sustainability principle, and that was seen in the adoption of several environmentally oriented soft law instruments like the long-term sustainability guidelines, the debris guidelines, planetary protection policies. But again, the applicability of some principle of international environmental law doesn't mean that necessarily space is an environment or that the whole field of international environmental law can automatically be applied. So we have been looking at how we can define space, how we can define the low Earth orbit and other spaces around Earth. And finally, we have been looking at space law from the COPUS perspective, from the ITU perspective. We have been looking at environmental law and what comes after. So some of those principles can be used for preventing damage, but we also need to understand what comes after. So what can we do when damage is already happening? The idea of liability and damage is defined again by the Outer Space Treaty, Article 7, but then is expanded in the Liability Convention. Liability may arise from the damage to any object or person and juridical person on Earth, in airspace or outer space. And it's important to understand which is the causality link between the damage that is occurring and the launching state or launching states that have caused that damage. There is no need, though, for the part that is injured to be part of the Liability Convention. Our preliminary conclusions on this aspect have been that there is not an agreement at the international level of what constitutes damage. We know that physical damage are addressed by the Liability Convention, so for example, damages caused by pieces of space debris. But interference from light pollution or radio frequency is really like challenging again the current framework for the application of the ideas of damages to space activities. So space is evolving, satellite constellation and other space activities are growing, so it really like the determination of fault and the determination of what is damage is changing, and the complexity in understanding what that means increase. I will conclude here because while some of these concepts may be very broad and interpreted in different ways at the international level, we will see how some of these concepts have been more punctually implemented by national legislations and national policy. So I will leave the floor to the national law team to go into the detail of this, some of these questions. Thank you.
Well, we have plenty of time for questions if there are any questions. Thank you for keeping to time.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk. Peter Grimley here. You mentioned remedial action. I'm quite interested in, sorry if this is a rather naive question, but I'm quite interested in how these international legal instruments deal with enforcement or dispute settlement. And do they say anything about what the remedial action might be, or how it is to be determined, or indeed how long it's likely to take?
Okay, the thing in space is that so far, from what I know, there has been only one case of an actual damage caused by space activity, and there are no courts that are dealing with the damage caused by space activity. So, from our experience so far, there hasn't been the necessity to apply these instruments, and so I cannot tell you how long it would take or how it would work, but that's why we need to start thinking about how to use damage, how to use the idea of the liability and damage also in these cases, because so far we didn't have so many activities, we only have a limited number of space objects in space until 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and now things are changing, and so this instrument that was not used as much as it could in the past decades now become always more relevant.
So thank you very much, Giuliana. So you mentioned about the articles in the Outer Space Treaty that are calling for due regard and balance of corresponding interests. And we've seen recently the US National Science Foundation, the US Federal Communications Commission is now asking satellite companies to coordinate with the US National Science Foundation. So, the first example has happened between SpaceX. Mm-hmm. So does this check the box, in your view, for this making due regard?
I mean, it may check the box, but the thing is that due regard is only one of the elements that needs to be considered. So, for example, space actors should be continually supervised. So, checking the box is one of the 10 boxes that needs to be checked to make sure that space activities are conducted in a right manner. So, for example, I think we heard a presentation yesterday on the fact that for now, so far in the US, there are no instruments that are looking at what happens throughout the life of a mission, of a satellite, we only look at when the mission is launched and when the mission, at the end of the mission. So what happens to the obligation of continually supervising a space activity. So I don't know if that checks the box for due regard, but I can say that that is only one of the boxes that needs to be checked. And so we need to look at all of the different tools that are provided by the Outer Space Treaty and other legal instruments.
Yeah, we could do one last question over there.
Thank you very much, Giuliana. It was a great talk. You make reference to damage, which is pretty clear in the case of space debris falling on someone's house. But is there also a notion or a concept in your frameworks that you're referencing regarding the fair access or equitable access to the resource space? So
yes, we have been looking at how to use, for example, analog frameworks in the ITU Convention for the geostationary orbit, and how those could be applied also to low Earth orbit and increase a little bit the understanding of equitable access and the implementation of the use of low Earth orbit in an equitable manner. There are several elements that could be considered for making sure that access to low Earth orbit could be more equitable. The thing is that we cannot count the number of orbital slots, for example, and so we need to understand how many satellites are too much. What does it mean? What does it mean for a limited natural resource to be limited in space? And that is something that I think requires some more technical understanding, and the combination of different elements. So the number of satellites that are already in orbit, the technological advancement in debris removal, for example, because that could create more space in low Earth orbit. So there are several different elements that needs to be understood to understand how to define the limits of a natural resource that is scarce. So we are going a little bit into the detail of this in the report, so I will share it. Once it's ready, I will share it for sure, yeah.
Thank you, Giuliana.
Thank you.